Hello Horror Hounds, it's time to look at Hammer's 1960 film, The Brides of Dracula. This is a direct sequel to their 1958 flick Dracula, starring Christopher Lee, also known as Horror of Dracula. Christopher Lee doesn't return, but don't let a lack of Lee put you off watching this, because it really is one of Hammer's best vampire flicks.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
How do you sequelize a film when your main villain was killed at the end of the first movie? Nowadays we would scoff at that conundrum. Thanks to Hammer's later Dracula sequels, we are now more than comfortable with the notion that Freddy, Michael and Jason will return again and again and again. After Dracula 1931 and the death of Bela Lugosi's count at the end of Universal's movie, Universal explored Dracula's family tree, starting off with the excellent Dracula's daughter, then son of Dracula, before resurrecting the count proper in later sequels. Hammer looked towards an extended family, the titular brides, although they're nothing of the sort really. The original script treatment was called Dracula's Disciple, and it's clear that Hammer were intending to go down the route of the continuing adventures of Van Helsing, Vampire Hunter. Some people understandably gripe that the title of this movie is a bait and switch. I like to view the title in the same way that nuns are referred to as the brides of Christ. They're kind of wedded to the church. So the titular brides of Dracula are simply those wedded to the satanic cult of the vampire. And that, my friends, is the kind of logical gymnastics that a Catholic upbringing will confer upon you. We know that Hammer always thought that Cushing was the star and didn't really treat Lee very well at all. So the film itself isn't really bothered that Dracula isn't returning. It starts with a brief voiceover that says, "Transylvania, land of dark forests, dread mountains and black, unfathomable lakes. Still the home of magic and devilry as the 19th century draws to a close. Dracula, monarch of all vampires, is dead, but his disciples live on to spread the cult and corrupt the world." And with that, we're off. Cushing doesn't appear until about 30 minutes in, but the first act without him is a perfectly self-contained little gothic horror story. There's a young ingenue having to spend a night in an old castle, various creepy, possibly untrustworthy or lying characters, a madman locked away who says that he's not mad, but he's been locked away by his mother so that she can steal his land and his rightful inheritance. Whilst Yvonne Monlau, who plays Marianne, our heroine, is perhaps not the most accomplished of actors, she's absolutely gorgeous to look at, and it has to be said that in this first act, before Van Helsing turns up, she holds the story together, surrounded by a fantastic cast of twisted, strange and very broad characters. We know something's up. She's been lured to the castle. Missing her carriage has been set up. Her carriage driver has been paid off and she's been abandoned in the town. So when Baroness Meinster just happens to arrive at the inn a little while later and just happens to invite her back up to the castle to spend the night so she can continue her journey the next day, we know something is up. We just don't know quite what. Baroness Meinster, played superbly by Martita Hunt, is a kind of strange Miss Havisham type character, and Hunt had previously played Miss Havisham from Dickens' Great Expectations. Completely untrustworthy. The fact that she sits there while Marianne eats and she doesn't herself partake of anything other than a very suspicious looking large glass of red wine, or is it wine, instantly leads us to suspect that the Baroness is the vampire. But she isn't. These are some nice new twists on old norms. Hunt does get turned into a vampire, and she deliciously again plays with our expectations, with the two sides to this character. As a woman, she's absolutely monstrous, But when she's turned into a vampire, she gets some strange kind of perspective and becomes weirdly sympathetic. She hides her fangs as though she's ashamed of them, and has made a clear attempt to sort of apply some makeup to her corpse-like face so she doesn't look quite dead. It's once she's turned into a vampire that we have some empathy and sympathy for her, because it's only after death that she realises how despicable her acts in life were. And then at her side, the ever-faithful Greta, who was a nanny to Baroness Meinster's child, this mysterious madman locked away in the castle. So if Baroness Meinster is sort of reborn anew after death as a vampire, Greta is also released by her mistress's death. In a different way, she goes completely flat out bonkers. It seems as though the Baroness's death means that she doesn't have to act proper anymore. There's no role for her now as servant to play, and she just lets it all hang out. Her insanity just bubbles to the surface pretty much straight away. She can finally air some of that long-developed Stockholm syndrome that's been bubbling away over the years as she's been bringing up the Baron Meinster from a boy into a man, and then as an adult vampire keeping him imprisoned in the castle and feeding young women to him. There was no Renfield character or Renfield analogue in Horror of Dracula. Like much of Stoker's narrative, that character got jettisoned in favour of streamlining with a keen eye on the budget. So Greta becomes the first human familiar or helper to the main vampire that we get in a Hammer film, certainly not the last. She's at her deranged best when we find her lying across the grave of a newly turned vampire bride, cooing and encouraging her to dig her way up out of the grave like a chick hatching from an egg. The second bride later on in the movie, Gina, we get to witness her resurrection as well, and despite being put in a padlocked coffin at the instructions of Van Helsing, who knows what he's talking about, there's a scene there where the coffin is being watched and the padlocks fall off one by one, still locked when they're picked up from the ground. It's a really nice, creepy bit of supernatural shenanigans, and it's a scene supposedly derived from M.R. James's story Count Magnus, but I say if you're going to steal from the best. And so we have the Baron himself, played by David Peel, the main vampire in the movie, and I think he's pretty great, to be honest. Many complain about the absence of the towering Christopher Lee in a film that bears his character's name in the title, and I understand that, but the fact is Peel gives a different but no less effective type of performance. His vampire is the perfect blend of boyish charm and aristocratic arrogance. Cinematographer Jack Asher gives him a wonderful aura of evil during the sort of close-up fangs and red eyes shots. Baron Meinster is certainly more effete than Lee's vampire, less imposing than Lee, but I think it works for this different kind of vampire. We learn of Baron Meinster's past from a speech that the Baroness gives and a recollection of Greta's of his childhood. They're enough to bring to vivid life visions of an entitled aristocrat, a bad child coddled rather than chastised, who in early manhood falls in with the wrong crowd, and the hint that one of the party there that took him down the wrong path and eventually made him what he was Dracula himself. He's the kind of silver spoon brat who never really did a lick of work in his life, and as a vampire was dominated by an overbearing mother and a forceful nanny. He had his food, the young women of the village, brought to him. So of course he's a spoilt rich brat vampire. He could never compare to Lee's imperious count, and he still relies on his nanny even in undeath. I like the idea of a vampire who has brought all of his flaws and failings from his human life, perhaps even his personality disorders, to his vampiric immortality. In Horror of Dracula, Van Helsing dismisses the notion that a vampire can change into a bat or a wolf as a common fallacy, but we all know that that's because the film didn't have the budget for any shape changing. I wish they'd stuck to that principle here, because the giant rubber bat is laughable. There are a couple of scenes where the bat is needed to stop, especially Van Helsing, stop him from getting somewhere or doing something. I view the big rubber bat with affection. It's all part and parcel of the Hammer charm. But I do wonder why they couldn't have just utilised a wolf form instead of a bat. Even an obviously trained Alsatian dog would have looked better as a transformed wolf form of a vampire than this big rubber thing on strings blocking Van Helsing's path. But there you go. As with its predecessor, and as you come to expect, especially from early Hammer films, The Brides of Dracula looks gorgeous. The colours, my God, the colours. Director of photography Jack Asher, again, painstakingly painting with light. I know it's a cliche to say that, but my God, just watch the film. The sets are beautiful. The costumes worn by the cast are beautiful. This film is always stunning to look at. A truly lavish production in every sense of the word, despite a surely low budget. And again, Peter Cushing as Van Helsing is he's a catwalk model. He looks so natty. More tie pins and three-piece suits, this time set off with a very dapper knitted tie, and the very welcome return of his fur-lined coat from the horror of Dracula. It's those little touches of continuity that I absolutely adore. I'm not too proud to admit that I cheered the return of the overcoat. The ending of Horror of Dracula is probably one of the best climactic face-off scenes in any vampire movie that has ever been made. So surely the end of The Brides of Dracula will suffer in comparison, and it kind of sort of does. But for the kind of film that Brides is, I really like the ending. It's still got a lot of gusto, a lot of energy to it, and a lot of completely unexpected things happen. Van Helsing gets bitten, something that Lee's Count didn't manage to do, followed by a crazy bit of self-surgery with a brand and some holy water that gives later sequels some really convenient outs for vampire bites. I don't know how cauterizing a vampire bite stops the spread of infection, but there you go. Just watch Cushing perform the absolute shit out of branding himself with a supposedly hot iron. He really, really sells this. Then Meinster attacks and gets burnt across the face with some holy water. That is all absolutely fantastic. Everything takes place in this kooky looking weirdly gothic windmill, and the exterior of that windmill looks so deliciously Tim Burton-esque that the ending of The Brides of Dracula really made me want to go straight away and rewatch Sleepy Hollow. The ending was to have the vampires destroyed by a swarm of bats released from hell after Van Helsing performs a ritual. Now, Peter Cushing quite rightly said that Van Helsing would not turn to the dark arts for the solution, so they had to come up with a different ending, and they would recycle this ending in the next film, The Kiss of the Vampire. The ending we get is so bonkers that I have to understand that it's brilliant. The mill burns down. In the greatest universal horror movie tradition, you have to have a burning building at the end of it. But Van Helsing jumping on the sails of the windmill and moving them round to form a cross and providing death by windmill is about one of the most rock and roll ways to kill a vampire I have ever seen. Until the Lost Boys come along with death by stereo, that is it. The only criticism I have of The Brides of Dracula is to ask why, oh why couldn't the brides have done something, anything, at the end of the movie? It's the film's only real weak spot. The film is called The Brides of Dracula and the brides do nothing. They spend the entire final showdown literally cowering in a doorway. They don't speak, they don't move. Where's the agency that vampirism has previously afforded these women? They're even more cowed and silent as part of Meinster's harem than they were as human women, and that's just not how vampires are in these Hammer movies. This face-off at the end should have been 3 vampires against 1 Peter Cushing rather than one-on-one, but they just hover in the doorway the whole time. That said, it's a small gripe for a fantastic movie that takes your expectations, tweaks them a little. That first 30 minutes is a self-contained gothic horror gem all in its own. Peter Cushing really steps into the role of Van Helsing here, and I'd suggest that his performance here, Van Helsing, is given more life and depth here than he is afforded in Horror of Dracula. So, in conclusion, it's something that you might have to whisper because it sounds a little bit like sacrilege. But The Brides of Dracula, even with the absence of Christopher Lee, might just be a better film than Horror of Dracula.